Jerome Wilson wasn't just a CEO, he was a man who built his hospitality empire from the ground up. With multiple luxury hotels under his name, he prided himself on delivering top-tier service, ensuring that every guest felt valued. But lately, something felt off. Complaints had been trickling in about one of his high-end hotels, stories of rude service, dismissive staff, and certain guests being treated unfairly. These weren't just minor hiccups, they pointed to a deeper problem. If there was one thing Jerome knew, it was that problems like this didn't fix themselves, they needed to be exposed. So, instead of sending a corporate memo or launching an internal investigation, Jerome decided to handle it himself. But he wouldn't walk in as the CEO. No suit. No entourage. No flashy entrance. Just a man booking a room for the night, dressed in casual clothes, ready to see how his own company really operated. Walking into the hotel, Jerome immediately noticed the ambience, the glowing chandeliers, polished floors, and the crisp scent of fresh linen in the air. The place looked perfect, but looks could be deceiving. The real test was in the service. He stepped up to the front desk, where a young woman named Kim was stationed. She was leaned back, scrolling through her phone, completely uninterested in the guests waiting in line. As Jerome approached, he cleared his throat slightly, expecting the usual professional greeting. Instead, Kim sighed loudly, barely looking up from her phone. When she finally acknowledged him, it wasn't with a welcoming smile or a polite "How can I help you?" Instead, she simply muttered, "Yeah?" like he was an inconvenience rather than a guest. Jerome remained calm. "I have a reservation, Jerome Wilson." Kim barely concealed a smirk as she turned to the computer, typing with the enthusiasm of someone who clearly didn't care. After a few seconds, she shrugged. "Nope. Don't see it." Jerome arched an eyebrow. "You sure about that?" Kim didn't even bother double-checking. She just returned to scrolling on her phone, as if the conversation was over. At this point, Jerome knew this wasn't a system issue, it was personal. He had experienced this kind of discrimination before, the quiet, subtle kind where someone takes one look at you and decides you don't belong. He calmly pulled out his phone and showed his confirmation email. "I have my booking right here." Kim barely glanced at the screen. "Yeah, well, the system doesn't lie." The irony of her words almost made Jerome laugh. Because he knew something she didn't, the system doesn't lie, but people do. Most people in this situation would have walked away, maybe demanded to speak to a manager. But Jerome wasn't most people. He owned this hotel. And he wasn't about to let this slide. Without another word, he pulled out his second phone, the one that gave him direct access to the hotel's internal system. He logged in, searched for his name, and there it was, his reservation, fully confirmed. Then, just to satisfy his curiosity, he checked the activity log, and what he found made his blood run cold. His reservation had been manually deleted. By Kim. Jerome inhaled deeply, suppressing a smirk. Oh, this was going to be interesting. Jerome Wilson had built a hospitality empire on the foundation of luxury, service, and respect for every guest who walked through his doors. But as he stood at the front desk of one of his own hotels, dressed in casual clothes, he was about to witness firsthand how some of his employees had strayed far from that mission. The lobby was immaculate, chandeliers gleamed, soft music played, and the scent of fresh flowers lingered in the air. Everything on the surface screamed luxury, but Jerome knew that true quality was measured in service, not aesthetics. He walked up to the front desk, expecting to be greeted professionally. Instead, he was ignored. Behind the counter stood Kim, a blonde woman in her 20s, leaned back against the desk, scrolling through her phone as if she had all the time in the world. Guests were waiting in line, shifting uncomfortably, clearing their throats to get her attention, but she didn't seem to care. Jerome, standing directly in front of her, cleared his throat and waited. Nothing. He tapped lightly on the desk. Still nothing. Finally, after a deep, exaggerated sigh, Kim looked up, barely meeting his eyes. Instead of a welcoming greeting, she simply muttered, "Yeah?" as if he had interrupted something important. Jerome remained calm. "I have a reservation. Jerome Wilson." Kim exhaled through her nose like she had just been asked to do the most exhausting task in the world. She typed lazily, her fingers moving across the keyboard with zero urgency. Nope. Don't see it." Jerome arched an eyebrow. "You sure about that?" Kim didn't even bother to double-check. She just shrugged and returned to scrolling on her phone. At first, Jerome thought maybe she was just a terrible employee, lazy, inattentive, unprofessional. But then, as he stepped aside and observed, he noticed a pattern. When white guests approached the desk, Kim's entire demeanor changed. She greeted them with a smile, took their reservations without hesitation, and even made small talk. But when guests of color stepped up, the attitude shift was impossible to ignore. She suddenly became cold, dismissive, and impatient. It wasn't just bad customer service. It was discrimination. Determined to see how far she would take this, Jerome stepped back to the desk and tried again. "I'd like a medium suite, please." Kim didn't even look up. "We're all booked." Jerome had just watched her assign rooms to other guests. He knew the system. There were plenty of available suites. "You're sure about that?" His voice was calm, but there was an unmistakable edge to it now. Kim sighed again, rolling her eyes. "Try another hotel." The room fell silent. Other guests were beginning to notice, exchanging uncomfortable glances. A bellhop near the luggage rack froze mid-step, pretending not to listen but clearly aware of the tension. Jerome stared at Kim for a long moment. He had seen enough. This wasn't just about him. How many other guests had she treated this way? How many had walked out feeling unwelcome, dismissed, less than? And most importantly, how long had this been going on under his watch? Kim had no idea who she was talking to. But she was about to find out. Jerome Wilson had built his hotel empire on a promise of luxury, service, and dignity. Yet, as he stood in the lobby of one of his own five-star establishments, ignored and dismissed by his own staff, it became painfully clear that something had gone very wrong. Kim, the front desk receptionist, had looked him up and down, made a snap judgment, and decided he wasn't worth her time. She had deleted his reservation right in front of him, assuming he wouldn't have the power or knowledge to fight back. But she was wrong. Jerome knew the inner workings of his hotel chain better than anyone. He didn't need to argue with Kim, he needed proof. Pulling out his personal company-issued phone, he logged into the hotel's internal reservation system. His credentials granted him full access, meaning he could see every booking, every transaction, every change. And there it was. His reservation, booked, confirmed, and then manually deleted. By Kim. Her name was right there next to the action. Timestamped, undeniable. Jerome felt a slow, simmering anger settle in his chest. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't some glitch in the system. This was deliberate. Kim had seen his face, made an assumption, and decided that he simply didn't belong at a hotel like this. She hadn't checked the system. She hadn't verified anything. She had just erased him. This wasn't just a bad employee making a mistake. This was a pattern, a systematic abuse of power, and if Kim was doing it so openly, it made Jerome wonder. How many other guests had she done this to? Jerome didn't just stop at his own reservation. With a few more taps, he pulled up guest complaints and internal records for this location. What he found made his stomach tighten. Multiple complaints about dismissive or rude service at the front desk. Guests stating they were denied rooms despite having valid reservations. Frequent reports of racial discrimination, though none had ever resulted in action. And one common thread in nearly every complaint, Kim. She had been at the center of countless issues, but the hotel's manager, Stephen Lane, had done nothing. Jerome scrolled further and saw why. Stephen was spineless, avoiding confrontation and ignoring reports instead of handling them. Kim had been a problem for a long time, and because nobody had held her accountable, she had only gotten bolder, more blatant, more discriminatory. And tonight, she had made the biggest mistake of her career. Jerome took a deep breath, centering himself. He could have stormed out and made calls from the privacy of his suite. But no, this needed to happen now, publicly, in front of everyone. He pocketed his phone and walked straight to the manager's office. He wasn't going to yell. He wasn't going to demand explanations. He was going to clean house. Jerome Wilson had seen enough. He had built his hotel empire on the foundation of excellence, inclusivity, and world-class service, yet here he was, standing in his own establishment, being disrespected and dismissed as if he didn't belong. But he wasn't just another guest. He was the owner, and it was time for some real accountability. Without hesitation, Jerome walked straight past Kim, who was still scrolling on her phone, oblivious to the storm that was about to hit, and into the manager's office. He didn't knock. He didn't need to. Stephen Lane, the hotel manager, looked up from his desk, startled. His face went pale the moment he recognized who was standing in front of him. "Mr. Wilson, what a surprise!" Stephen stammered, clearly scrambling for words. Jerome wasn't in the mood for small talk. He crossed his arms and fixed Stephen with a cold stare. "Do you know what's happening at your front desk, Stephen?" The manager blinked rapidly. Well, I think." "Wrong answer," Jerome cut him off. His voice was calm, but his authority was unmistakable. "I just had my own reservation deleted. By your employee. Care to guess who?" Stephen swallowed hard. "Kim," he muttered weakly. Jerome smirked. Ding, ding, ding. Stephen looked like he wanted to sink into his chair. "Mr. Wilson, I was going to handle it. I swear." "Handle it?" Jerome raised an eyebrow. "You've had complaints about her for months. Hell, maybe years. You knew about this. And you did nothing." Stephen opened his mouth but shut it again, realizing there was no excuse that would save him. Jerome exhaled, shaking his head. "Here's how this is going to go, Stephen. You're going to walk out there and fire her. Right now. In front of everyone." Stephen's face turned ghost white. "Right now?" "But right now, Stephen." There was no room for negotiation. No more excuses. Jerome had given him the chance to act, and he had failed. Now, it was happening on Jerome's terms. With reluctance, Stephen stood up, adjusted his tie, and walked out of the office with Jerome right behind him. The lobby was still bustling with guests, and a few staff members paused what they were doing, sensing something was about to happen. Kim was leaning against the counter, still half distracted by her phone, when Stephen approached her. "Kim, we need to talk." She rolled her eyes. "Ugh, what now?" she muttered. Stephen took a deep breath. "You're fired. Effective immediately." Silence. For the first time that night, Kim was speechless. Her face twisted in shock and confusion. "Wait, what?" Stephen stood firm. "You've repeatedly ignored complaints, mistreated guests, and tonight, You deleted a customer's reservation out of pure bias. That's unacceptable, and your employment here is over." Kim's face flushed red. She turned to Jerome, suddenly putting the pieces together. "Wait a second, you set me up." Jerome tilted his head, his smirk unapologetic. "No, Kim. You set yourself up. I just gave you enough rope to show your true colors." Kim looked around for support, but none of her coworkers stepped in. Even Stephen, who had protected her incompetence for far too long, wasn't going to save her now. With an angry huff, she grabbed her things and stormed out of the hotel, throwing one last hateful glare over her shoulder. Jerome? He just smiled. Because justice had been served. And this was only the beginning. As the hotel lobby fell silent, all eyes turned toward the unfolding scene. Kim stood frozen behind the front desk, her phone clutched in her hand, her usual smirk nowhere to be found. The reality of the moment was starting to sink in. She had just been fired, and there was no talking her way out of this one. But Jerome Wilson wasn't done yet. He had come here to fix a problem, and firing Kim was just the first step. "Wait, this isn't fair." Kim finally blurted out, her voice bordering on desperation. "I didn't even do anything wrong. It was just a mistake." Jerome chuckled, but there was no amusement in it. "A mistake? You mean like how you accidentally deleted my reservation? Or how you accidentally dismissed multiple guest complaints? Or maybe how you accidentally refused service to certain customers?" Kim's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. Jerome leaned in slightly. "Kim, I don't tolerate incompetence. But you weren't just bad at your job. You were malicious. And that's why you're done here." Her face turned red, her hands balling into fists, but she knew there was nothing left to say. She snatched up her bag, threw one last glare at Stephen, who was still too stunned to speak, and stormed toward the exit. As the doors swung shut behind her, a tense silence settled over the room. The rest of the employees stood still, unsure of what would happen next. And that's when Jerome turned his attention to management. Stephen Lane, the spineless hotel manager, looked like he wanted to disappear. Sweat beaded on his forehead as Jerome fixed him with a cold, unreadable stare. "You know, Stephen, I almost respect Kim more than I respect you right now," Jerome said, his voice low and measured. Stephen blinked, his face draining of color. "Yes, sir, I." "At least she was honest about who she was," Jerome continued. "You, on the other hand? You let this happen. You let her run your front desk like her own personal VIP club, deciding who was worth serving and who wasn't. And you did nothing." Stephen swallowed hard. "Mr. Wilson, I didn't know it was this bad. I was going to." Jerome cut him off with a single raised hand. "Don't lie to me." Stephen clamped his mouth shut, looking like a man staring down his own execution. "I went through the records, Stephen," Jerome continued. "Guest complaints, staff reports, hell, even security footage. Kim has been a problem for a long time, and you ignored every warning. You let your hotel turn into a customer service nightmare, and now?" He stepped closer, lowering his voice just enough to make Stephen sweat. "Now, you're done." Stephen staggered back, his eyes widening in horror. "Wait, please. I can fix this. I swear." Jerome sighed, shaking his head. "You had your chance. You let me clean up your mess when it should have been your responsibility from the start. And I don't have patience for managers who can't manage." With a final nod toward security, Jerome watched as two guards stepped forward. Stephen's shoulders slumped in defeat. He knew there was no second chance coming. As the guards led him out of the office, Jerome turned back to the rest of the hotel staff, most of whom stood frozen, watching the events unfold like a real-life corporate execution. "Listen up," Jerome said, addressing everyone in the room. "This hotel is part of my brand. My name is on the line every single day. And what I just saw, that's not how we do things." He let the weight of his words settle before continuing. "From now on, we do things differently. Every guest, regardless of who they are, gets treated with the respect and service they deserve. No more games. No more discrimination. No more excuses." The room was dead silent. Then, slowly, one of the younger clerks nodded in agreement. Another let out a breath, a sign of relief. Jerome smirked. "Good. Now, let's get back to work." As the last echoes of Stephen Lane's desperate pleas faded, Jerome Wilson turned his attention back to the hotel staff, his presence commanding the room. The weight of what had just happened was still thick in the air. Kim had been fired, Stephen was out, and now all eyes were on him. But firing a few bad employees wouldn't fix the problem. Jerome wasn't here for a Band-Aid solution. He was here to tear out the rot at its roots and rebuild from the ground up. Jerome reached for the hotel phone and dialed a direct corporate line. The room held its breath as they listened. "This is Wilson. Effective immediately, shut this location down for a full-scale audit. No new bookings, no check-ins, no exceptions. Every guest currently staying will be fully comped. And I want a team here within the hour." The entire front desk seemed to freeze. A nervous clerk, barely in his 20s, swallowed hard before speaking up. "Sir, you're shutting down the whole hotel?" Jerome nodded sharply. "That's right. We're going to fix this place properly." Another staff member, a young woman, hesitated before asking, "What does that mean for us? Are we all getting fired?" Jerome scanned the faces in front of him. Some were nervous, others relieved, and a few looked guilty, likely knowing they had played some part in the mess that had unfolded. "No, not everyone. But let's be clear, anyone who can't meet the standards we're about to set will be gone." Within an hour, a corporate task force arrived. The team included high-level executives, HR specialists, and guest experience consultants. The lobby buzzed with activity as guests were informed about the closure, offered refunds, and even upgrades at other hotels in the chain. Meanwhile, Jerome assembled the remaining staff in a conference room. He didn't sit at the head of the table. He stood, leaning forward, commanding the room without needing to raise his voice. "This hotel has been running on bad habits and worse leadership," he started, his tone measured but firm. "That ends today. From this moment forward, we rebuild. And that means new policies, new training, and a new way of treating every single guest who walks through that door." He let that settle before continuing. "If any of you have a problem with that, if you think things were fine the way they were, then this isn't the place for you." A few glances were exchanged, but no one spoke. "Good. Because from now on, everything changes." Jerome wasted no time rolling out a complete overhaul of how the hotel operated. Mandatory training: every employee, from housekeepers to front desk agents, was required to undergo intensive training on customer service, diversity, and professionalism. No more casual indifference, every guest would be treated with respect. New hiring standards: HR began reevaluating every staff member's role. Those who had contributed to the toxic culture were let go, while those who showed potential were offered additional coaching and leadership training. Real guest feedback: Jerome introduced a direct feedback system, allowing guests to report any issues immediately, not weeks later, when it was too late to fix them. Surprise inspections: to ensure standards were upheld, Jerome and his corporate team would be making random, unannounced visits to assess performance firsthand. By the end of the week, the entire atmosphere of the hotel had shifted. Employees who once ignored complaints now took initiative. New hires with genuine enthusiasm replaced those who had treated the job as a paycheck and nothing more. Most importantly, guests noticed the change. A woman checking in for the first time smiled at the front desk clerk, who greeted her with genuine warmth. "Wow, the service here is incredible. I heard this place had issues before, but it's like a whole new hotel." Jerome, standing nearby, overheard the comment. He allowed himself a small, satisfied nod. Because that's exactly what it was. A hotel reborn, and this time, it would be built the right way. As the dust settled on the hotel's transformation, Jerome Wilson stood at the heart of his empire, knowing that this moment was about more than just one hotel. It was about setting a new standard, not just for his business, but for the industry as a whole. The changes had been swift and absolute. Kim was gone. Stephen was fired. The toxic culture that had festered under the surface was excised like a disease, and in its place, a renewed commitment to excellence was beginning to take root. But this wasn't just about getting rid of bad employees, it was about sending a message that disrespect and discrimination had no place in his business. Within days, news of what had happened spread far beyond the walls of that single hotel. Social media exploded with praise for Jerome's bold stance. Guests who had once been ignored or mistreated returned to share their gratitude. Employees who had been too afraid to speak up finally found their voices, knowing their CEO actually cared about the culture of his company. Other hotels in the chain took notice. Managers across the country scrambled to reevaluate their own staff. If Jerome was willing to shut down an entire location to fix a problem, then no one was safe from accountability. More importantly, competitors started paying attention. The hospitality industry was built on appearances, but Jerome was proving that true success wasn't about chandeliers and high-thread count sheets, it was about how people were treated. A week later, Jerome took the stage at an industry conference, standing before a room full of executives, managers, and business leaders. He wasn't there to sugarcoat the issue. "Let me make something clear," he said, his voice strong and unwavering. "I didn't fire an employee because she was rude. I fired her because she actively tried to exclude certain customers. I fired a manager because he let it happen. And I shut down an entire hotel because I refused to let my business stand for anything less than respect and excellence." The room was silent, the weight of his words pressing down on everyone. Too many of you are comfortable with business as usual. You ignore the complaints, you brush off the bad reviews, you pretend problems will fix themselves. Well, they won't. Leadership isn't about sitting in a boardroom, it's about making sure that every single person who walks into your establishment is treated like they belong there. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some executives shifted uncomfortably, knowing they had been guilty of exactly what he was describing. Others nodded, inspired by his no-nonsense approach. "This isn't just about my company. It's about all of us. And if you're not willing to hold your people accountable, if you're not willing to demand better, then you're part of the problem." By the time Jerome stepped off that stage, the impact had already begun. Executives approached him, wanting to know more about his approach. Journalists lined up, eager to cover his story. Back at the hotel, the transformation was undeniable. Employees took pride in their work. Guests noticed the difference in service. And most importantly, the toxic culture that had once plagued the front desk was gone. Jerome knew that this was only the beginning. Fixing one hotel was a victory, but changing an industry, that was his ultimate goal. Because in the end, his business wasn't just about luxury rooms and five-star service. It was about respect, integrity, and the power of doing what's right. True leadership isn't about sitting in an office making decisions from a distance. It's about understanding what's happening on the ground and taking action when necessary. Jerome Wilson's story teaches us that turning a blind eye to problems only allows them to fester, whether in business or in life. Ignoring an issue doesn't make it go away, it makes it worse. Accountability is another crucial lesson. It's easy to say you stand for fairness and equality, but actions speak louder than words. When Jerome held both employees and management accountable, he set a powerful example. If you tolerate poor behavior, you become part of the problem. Change often starts with one bold decision. It's uncomfortable, sometimes disruptive, but necessary. Whether in the workplace, in our communities, or in personal relationships, standing up for what's right might make waves, but those waves lead to real progress. Lastly, respect and integrity should never be optional. Whether dealing with employees, customers, or strangers, treating people with fairness and kindness shouldn't depend on who they are or what they look like. True success isn't just about what you build, it's about the impact you leave behind.